critical mass, so I'm sure some people will still trickle into the room. It's my pleasure today to announce Amir Levinson. Amir is visiting us from Tel Aviv University. He's staying here until the summer on sabbatical. Amir is an expert on, what should I say, high energy physics, plasma physics, very, very broad interests and expertise. So talk to him about any theoretical problem. Go and find him. He's on the 14th floor before he leaves us. Amir will tell something today about nuclear reactions induced by the passage of radiation-mediated shocks.
The title will be clear by the end of the talk.
Perfect. And I don't have to read it in full. Although I got to 90%. Thanks, Amir.
Okay, thank you, Bart, and thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure. So I've been here a little over a month, and I already feel home, but I also realized that we probably had more than enough plasma talks. So I decided to talk about something else. My research in recent years actually focused on plasma physics, but I have also this topic which I've been devoting over a decade to study. And so basically, what I'll describe today is a work by a graduate student in our group, along with not, who actually discovered that shocks driven in binary neutron star merger ejecta can induce nuclear transmutation, which can affect the very early kilonova signal. So I will discuss this at the end. I will start with, stop. Please join us in team. Right? So I'll start with stating a fact that I'm sure you all know, which is that many stellar systems in the universe, by the way, there's a pointer. Okay. So that many stellar systems in the universe are doomed to explode. And you see here some notable examples. By the way, if something is unclear, please ask. So you see here some notable examples. Essentially, all type of supernovae explode. BNS mergers, and this will be the focusing method. And also gamma ray bursts. There are other examples, but these are the most discussed ones. And the key feature in all of these explosions is the formation of a shock. So a shock of a type known as radiation-mediated shock, RMS, and I use this acronym throughout the talk, so please remember. So these shocks, driven the explosion, it propagates in the envelope, and once reaching the photosphere, it emits the first light released from all the systems. It's very difficult to detect because it has short duration. It's preceding the supernova or the afterglow emission. But there are attempts, dedicated experiments to try and find this. Now, all of these examples here are actually animations, but this image is a real data. What you see here on the left or right, depending on the viewpoint, is the light from supernova 1987-9. Some of you might be old enough like me to remember this event. And here on the right, it's the same piece of sky before the explosion. So people actually was able to identify the progenitor. I'm not going to go into all this.
87A was discovered here in Toronto by someone in Toronto.
Well, actually, I think that the first images were taken by amateur astronomers. That's why they have such a timing. That's a story I know. And they reported this.
We tell a different story here.
All right. So let's not. The important thing is, I want to say that this system is famous. It's not because of the light, because it's the first and only supernova from which a burst of heavy neutrinos have been detected. a burst of about 10 seconds, 11 seconds. And what's interesting is that there was a delay of, I think, 3 hours, I don't remember exactly, between detection of the neutrinos and the light. And this delay actually indicates the time it takes the shock to propagate in the envelope and reach the photosphere. I'll explain it here. All right. So these kind of shocks will be now at the focus of it. So let me just quickly say why there is some interest to study these systems. The main one, I think, is that this shock breakout signal, the light emitted once the shock reaches the photosphere, carries valuable information or imprint of the nature of the progenitor, its pre-explosion evolution, and in the last couple of years, there are very interesting observation of this, and in particular, the explosion mechanism. So this is one reason why there are now, it's priority targets for these experiments like ultrasat, hopefully will be launched at some point. And tragic factories like ZTF, maybe LSST and some X experiments. And the reason is that, again, it's very difficult to detect the signal. These experiments will try to cover the sky and just pick them up. There are very few examples now for shock breakout candidates. Now, in order to extract this information, one needs a very detailed shock model. Actually, to calculate the structure and emission of these shocks. And you can see detailed discussion in these reviews by Katzenwachsman and review by myself and my colleague Makar. This is not what I'm going to discuss here. I just say that a very interesting type of explosion is aspherical explosions, mainly those produced by so-called hidden jets that don't have enough energy to break out of the stellar envelope. And the reason why these are particularly interesting is, one reason is that there might be neutrino sources, and there are attempts to find cessation and all this stuff. So all of these are good reasons to study the systems, and as I said, I devoted more than a decade, but I'm not going to discuss any of this topic in this talk. The theme of this talk will be something we discovered recently, which is, as I mentioned already, is that the shock produced in merger ejecta and other system, if they are fast enough, they can actually, by a process that I will explain later, they can actually induce nuclear transmutation that can change the composition behind the shock. And this could affect the opacity and the actual signal emitted. So, and I will focus on merger ejecta, which are the most interesting in this respect. All right, so that will be actually one thing. So the outline for the rest of the talk is here. I will start now with a very brief explanation of the shock breakout process, in a bit more detail, and then say a few words about this type of shocks, radiation-mediated shocks, what are these, etc. And then I move on to discuss an important issue that I actually realized only 4 years ago, which is how the forces are mediated to all plasma constituents. I will explain this. And finally, at the end, I will introduce the multi-ion shock model and discuss the results of it. All right, so let me start with, oops, there is a delay. It's because of the Zoom, I guess, like a huge delay between my screen. Okay, so let's see if the movie runs. But anyway, I'm going to show you a movie from a simulation which intended to actually illustrate this process for all of these systems. But this particular simulation was devised to study GW170817, this neutron star collision event detected by LIGO. And basically, what you're going to see in the simulation is the ejection of a jet. Not continuous ejection, but ejection for some period of time, about 1 second. And the shock driven by this ejecta, by this jet. So here it is. Okay. You can see that in this particular example, the jet is shocked. It's ejected for, it doesn't have enough energy to actually go all the way through the envelope, through the ejecta, sorry. But you see the cocoon, it drives this cocoon, which is bounded by the shock. This is the shock material. So the explosion mechanism in this particular simulation is this launching of this jet. And in this case, the shock near the jet edge is actually relativistic. It has a velocity profile, angular profile. So velocity depends you. But the point is that the point is that in all of these explosions, the shock propagates in a medium with a declining density, and the density declines fast enough such that the optical depth from the momentary location of the shock to infinity also declines with radius. Now, initially, the opacity of the envelope is huge, so because of the large optical depth, the radiation is actually trapped inside the shock. And this is the reason why it's mediated, that I will explain next. But as it propagates outwards, the opacity decreases with time until it reaches a radius at which the photon diffusion time to infinity is shorter than the expansion time. So what that means is that the radiation will leak out very quickly over less than expansion scale, it will just be released. So this is the breakout process. And actually when it happens, the shock undergoes a transition from radiation mediated to collision length. That's not important for this talk. But this is actually the first time that you will see. After the shock breaks out, the envelope itself, the shocked envelope that was hit by the shock, keep expanding and radiating, and this is known as the cooling emission. So this is well known in supernova. And this is a signal that you actually want to detect in order to bring down the progenitor properties and explosion.
Who throws this envelope out? When was this envelope material?
Yeah, this envelope, in reality, not in the simulation.
Yeah.
In reality, when the neutron star collides, even before, they eject.
Material beforehand, before the final value.
Yeah, they eject a slow outflow. By slow, I mean it depends. There are actually several types of outflow. I don't know if it is. But they are slow in the sense that they are subrelativistic. So the small y region is around the equator with velocity of 0.1 c. And there is, the ejecta has some angular dependence, but roughly speaking, at the edge it might be quite fast, but most of this, the bulk of the ejecta moves. At least what people claim from the kilonova, the first velocity was around 0.2, 0.3 c, depending on the work. So this is actually the unshocked medium, and the jet, and actually I'll show it here. Oh, okay. I'll show it here. So this is the actual data from GW170817. And what you see here is the chirping signal detected by LIGO. And this marks the collision of the neutron star. And you see that with some delay, about 1.7 seconds later, there was a gamma ray flash detected by Swift. And it has a duration of about 2 seconds. And so, to explain this, people realize that the jet has to be injected, to be launched about half a second after the collision. So what's happening is that the neutron star collide, some material, some outflow is ejected, and then there is some hypermassive neutron star eventually collapses into a black hole cell, and then the jet is launched. And once it's launched, it's propagating in the ejecta. And the details depend on this delay. By the time the jet is ejected, the ejecta propagates to some distance. And let's say this. Now, this short gamma burst, initially it was thought that this is just a normal short burst, and people were happy because the claim was that it actually confirmed the model from 1988 something, that short GRBs are associated with neutron star collision. But then quickly it was realized that this is actually a peculiar event, mainly because it was extremely dim. The luminosity was 3-4 orders of magnitude smaller than the luminosity of a typical short GRB. So
isn't that exactly the same as 98 or 425? That it verified the core collapse equals long GRB, but then it was many orders of magnitude different than that long GRB was in.
I don't remember, but this is anyway a short job. But the point is that, people try to explain this low luminosity by doing an effect. But there was one model which I personally like, because it's the only model where actually computed this from first principle. And this was the claim that this actually marks a short shock breakout event. So the emission does not come from the jet, but comes from shock breakout. So you can read this paper by Caltech group and collaboration of Caltech and Israeli groups. And they actually managed to explain this quite successfully, not only the light curve, but the temperature and everything else. At that time, it wasn't clear if there is a jet or not. So the simulation I showed here was actually devised. It's amazing. Was devised actually to check whether you can reduce the signal with shock jet or with successful jet. But then, eventually, 1 year later, a jet was detected. Is there a way to avoid this delay? It's about 5-6 seconds.
You're asking a room of theorists.
It might be if you, when you do the share screen on Zoom, you can choose a video optimization, which might deal with it.
No, actually. All right, sorry, I'll try to avoid this somehow. So, so as I said, in 2018, a jet was detected. The source will die detected a superlunar motion. From this, it was possible to constrain the opening angle and the path Lorentz factor, and it was clear from the jet. And what's important in the context of my talk is that regardless of the particular model for the gamma ray flash, it's clear that a jet was launched in the source, and this jet must have driven a very strong shock in the ejecta. So people that don't like this model for the gamma ray flash, have alternative ideas. But I mean, the fact that there is a shock there and there's additional indication from the afterglow, are quite strong. So this is like strong motivation to see this model.
But to just summarize, is the current thinking that there's still large error bars on the prompt gamma ray luminosity? I mean, the afterglow, multiband afterglow is now well modeled, right?
It's, I think so. There are some issues with this late time modeling. I don't want to get into this thing.
But the very prompt, fastest part, there's still big error bars on how many gamma ray were actually produced. depending on
I don't remember, I don't think they are that large, there was. I mean, it's definitely clear that the luminosity is at least 3 orders of magnitude smaller than a typical short GRB. Well,
what would that give the luminosity of the afterglow?
no, of the quantum emission.
Well, no, but you would take the energy in the afterglow shock. That's also 3 orders down.
Yeah, I mean, the shock breakout energy is small. I mean, you can actually calculate this if you take the width of the breakout, which is, I'll show it in a minute, but the width, right, you can calculate that for depth. And then, you need a thing, you can calculate the mass enclosed in this layer. And it carries a very small fraction of the total energy.
No, I'm just asking you empirically. If you model the broadband afterglow and ask how much energy is in the jet, then you need to explain that. That's also down substantially from the typical short GRB.
Well, I'm not sure. I think what you see in the afterglow is the first rise, the claim is used by the slow ejecta, and then the jet pops up because it's off axis.
Okay, but this
is modeled with, there are some versions, but I think that this is what
this was the basis of my question, because if there's some fast material that's initially off axis,
well, I can refer you to the paper if it's
then
the model.
that would be dominating the gamma emission.
Well, the one gamma emission is emitted very early on, but what I can say is that these guys, they successfully modeled the shock breakout, not only the energy, but also the spectrum and everything, and the afterglow, and it seems to be consistent. There is one free parameter, which is actually the radius of the breakout.
So you're basically talking about the gamma rays from the off-axis shock breakout that would be visible on the short time scale.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, the afterglow came later, of course. All right. Let me continue. So I have convinced you in the workshop. And now let me briefly explain what are these radiation-mediated shocks, what's the physics. So first of all, as you know, a shock by definition is a discontinuity in the global system that produces an entropy. And the dissipation mechanism depends on the microphysics. In astrophysics, there are 2 main types. One is collision shocks, where it's plasma physics, plasma collective effects. And in these shocks, the dissipation mechanism is radiating. And what happens actually is quite simple. If you look at this illustration, this is the upstream, this is the velocity profile. Plasma incoming into the shock produces radiation either by advection of radiation, like in gamma ray bursts, or by producing radiation in the shock transition layer mainly by brainstorm emission. The radiation eventually reaches downstream. It dominates the energy density, and a fraction of the photons stream backwards. So these photons that move backwards toward the upstream, they interact with the incoming plasma, mainly through Compton scattering, and so they are exerting radiation drag on the incoming plasma, and this is what actually decelerates the flow. It's this radiation drag. And this is a self-consistent process. I mean, the generation of photons, and there are very detailed models that can actually produce this. And the width of the shocks is typically Thomson length. I will show now some more detail. And one thing you can ask immediately is under which conditions we anticipate the shocks to form. So there are basically 2 conditions which are related. The first one is that the downstream is radiation dominated, namely the radiation pressure is much larger than the plasma pressure. So this has to be satisfied. And if you combine this with a jump condition, you find that the velocity of the shock should exceed this. This is a velocity measured in units of the speed of light. Okay? So the velocity of the shock has to be larger than about 10 to the minus 4, the speed of light, with a very weak dependence on the density. Here it's normalized to what you expect in supernova. Now, this condition is satisfied essentially in all of these exploding systems. So that's why we expect them to be radiation depleted. The other condition is that the photons are trapped inside the shock in order to discern the incoming flow. This can also be estimated very simply by comparing the diffusion time of radiation across the shock, so that the radiation from the downstream is diffusing into the upstream. At the same time, the flow propagates to the downstream. So if this diffusion time is much slower than the shock crossing time, you cannot actually reach the upstream. That's not even directed over. So this condition, this condition implies that the optical depth to infinity has to be larger than 1 over the shock velocity units of speed of light. For Newtonian shock, this can be 10 to 100, and for relativistic shock, it's over unity. And actually, you can show that the width of the shock transition itself is roughly this number. This is consistent with the momentum transfer scale. If you solve the dynamical equation, you can show that the plasma accelerates in the scale. It's consistent. So all of this is satisfied in all of these envelopes of the exploding stuff. I will skip this.
Before you go on,
This is for plasma physicists.
if you have the first condition, if you have a shock in a massive star, the upstream could already be radiation dominated, so you don't need to satisfy
That's
that.
it. So that's a different story. Could be also in that different. But as long as the temperature upstream is much smaller than downstream, if it's not smaller than downstream, it will not form a shock in the first place. It will be just a compression rate. So it has to be, even if light, it has to be much smaller than the temperature downstream. If this is satisfied, the picture doesn't change much, only quantitatively, it's basically the same. So what I'm saying is that, in other words, if the velocity is much larger than this, and the shock is strong enough, it doesn't matter. See this? So I said I'm not going to talk about it, but let me just show you some example of this calculation. And there is a point I want to make here, which is that you can actually calculate self-consistently the structure, the spectrum emitted by the shock, and everything. In particular, because the microphysics is known, or at least that's what we started to do, unlike collision shock. But there is an assumption made in all of the models derived until now, which is that the plasma, you can do a single fluid model, namely that all of the plasma constituents are infinitely coupled. So there is only one center of momentum frame to the whole system. If you assume this, it's very simple to calculate. You see here some examples of, let's say, spectral evolution during the breakout from the wing, blah, blah, blah. What I want to point out here is the following. So here you see a bunch of velocity profile for shocks with different velocities, from Newtonian 0.1 to highly relativistic, Lorentz factor of 20. And this shows the positron abundance, or pair multiplicity. And you can see that even for 0.5, the positron density inside the shock is already large. It's 10 to 20. And then for every electron, you have 20 positrons. And if you go to more relativistic shock, it's huge. It's like 10,000 for highly relativistic shocks. So once the shock velocity exceeds, 0.34, you're dominated by pairs in terms of number density. And that's going to be important. So now, I want to move to the next question, next issue. And the issue is, how do you mediate these forces in reality to all plasma constituents? And the point is the following. Most of the energy in these shocks is carried by ions because they are much more massive. Okay? On the other hand, the radiation only acts on the electrons and positrons because the cross-section of the ions, this is like cross-section of the ions is smaller by the mass ratio squared than the cross-section of electrons. So they practically don't feel any radiation force. So if you think about the plasma incoming into the shock, the electrons very quickly start decelerating, but the ions just keep moving. So what actually mediates the force from the electrons to the ion? That's the question. Okay?
Yeah.
All right.
Waiting for the answer.
The answer is no. I'm verifying that you're. All right. So here is. So I'm going to show what was the conventional wisdom of Levinson. And then 4 years ago I discovered it's actually wrong. So let me start with a very simple example. I have a non-relativistic shock moving in a single ion species. Let's say the plasma consists only of hydrogen or something, and no positrons, only electrons. In this case, the picture is very simple, and that has been the conventional wisdom for many years. What's happening here, the electron will start decelerating. This will produce charge separation inside the shock. This charge separation produces an electrostatic field. The electrostatic field decelerates the ions and accelerates the electron, and that's how they couple. And you can show that the velocity separation, it's in my pattern, is tiny. 10 to the minus 18 or 19 speed of light is sufficient. So you don't care about it. You can safely assume a single fluid model. That's what people have thought for many years. However, when you go to the relativistic case, for example, situation is more involved because now you have positrons, and actually the abundance is not small, it's quite large. And here you cannot couple the species by electrostatic force, and the reason is that the electric force is directed oppositely for the electron and positron. So for the positrons feel the radiation force and the electrostatic force, like the ions. And so you see that here the positrons will decelerate. You will have larger deceleration, and in any way you cannot couple the species. So clearly something is missing, some piece of physics is missing.
Don't you also have this in a non-relativistic shock if you have two ion types? Or
Yeah, that's the third example. And that's the example relevant to my talk. But this is actually somewhat more useful. And so as Chris mentioned, the third example is it can actually occur also in non-relativistic shock, is a case where the shock propagated a multi-ion plasma, and typically these multi-ions have different charge to mass ratio. And the deceleration on the electric field depends on the charge to mass ratio. If they have different charge to mass ratio, they experience different deceleration rate. And so again, you cannot couple them by electrostatic fields. Some physics is missing to actually produce the entire shock condition. So that's the problem, and this effect will play an important role in the last problem. Let me just show you, since we studied in detail the relativistic case, let me show you just an example that illustrates what's missing. So first of all, when I realized that, I constructed a semi-analytic multi-fluid model, which you see here, and what I found is indeed that what you see here is the velocity profile, or what's the profile, but indeed you start upstream with no positrons. They're only produced at some point where the velocity is large enough. And by that time, the electrons are strongly coupled by this electrostatic field. However, over time, this red line shows the positron density. You see the positron start being produced in the shock. Once their density approaches about 1/4 of the electron density, they actually screen the electric field. You see this electric field, reverse side, and there is a very large separation. And you see that the ions are not influenced. You don't feel anything. So it was clear that something, what's missing here is some sort of friction. And in this paper, I discussed some phonological friction model, it's not important. But then when I realized that I contacted Arno and Sasha and this numerical cowboys, and they were interested to do these peak simulations. And I'm showing you an example of 2D peak simulation. It's not global simulation because the scale separation is huge. But what we do here, we take a box filled with plasma, ions and electrons and positrons, and we radiate it by radiation. And so what's happened, this is shown in the rest frame of the upstream flow. So acceleration here means deceleration in the lab frame. So you can see what's happening is that this quickly becomes unstable to bring instabilities. It develops plasma turbulence on kinetic scales, much smaller than the radiation scale. And you see that the protons actually start decelerating. And the reason is that this turbulence transfers momentum between the different species. So in this relativistic shock, single-ion relativistic shock, that's what happens. You actually couple the ion by plasma instability, and turned out that plasma physics is still important in this type of shocks. Just relativistic. So that's the idea. Okay, so a similar thing is missing in the multi-ion shock, and I'm going to discuss. So in the last part of the talk, I want to actually introduce the multi-ion model, multi-ion RMS model, and show you its stages what's actually happening because of this effect, velocity separation. So let me first say that I showed already simulation of jet propagation in an ejecta, but it has been studied in detail later on by different groups. I'm showing here a schematic illustration from a paper by a Japanese group led by Hamid Hamidani, who is more Japanese than Japanese actually. And they had a very nice model, both analytically backed up by hydro simulation, to make a long story short, to see the structure. What they find is that the shock has velocity has angular dependence. So here, it's actually relativistic, but the velocity becomes smaller and smaller as you go to larger angles. But there is a region, like here, where the shock is fast. Its velocity, let's say, exceeds 0.3 velocity of speed of light. This number is good. And so what I'm going to describe next is relevant only to this region. Now this shock material here occupies a very small fraction, not very, but small fraction of the total ejecta. So this shock does not affect the whole ejecta, it affects a small fraction. So why do we care? Because this hot material is the one is going to break first. And so the very early kilonova emission is going to be emitted by this material. And so if you really want to compute the very early light curve, they have some discussion in these papers. Then you really, you should pin down the opacity, and that means pinning down the composition. So that's where the story is going to be relevant. Okay. By very early, I mean, depending on some parameters, it's the first few minutes to few hours. This hasn't been seen in GW 1708, because if I remember, they only point the telescope half a day after they discovered GW flash. So we are all waiting for the next one to happen. And
Swift is down to 120 seconds, so it's possible.
Yeah, but nature does not
Or
comply
not
with
to
us.
happen again.
I probably I'll probably be retired way before that.
Swift will last, might not last until you retire.
I guess there will be, but at least though, yeah, I don't know. So, so that's what I mean by it. Okay, so now what I'm going to show is also that if the shock is launched at very early time, it will propagate in the ejecta at a stage where it is still full of free neutrons. I will show more. So either the shock propagates after the freeze-out, when neutrons disappear, or it propagates before the freeze-out, where free neutrons actually use the boundaries.
How do the free neutrons get accelerated once received?
No, they don't. I'll get to them. Okay. So, as I said, the model is a multi-ion model. These are the basic quantities. We assume a planar shock, steady state. It's time independent in the shock frame. And we allow for positrons, but not for present, in this work, not for self-consistent production. So all of the ions are characterized by density or abundance, by charge, and by atomic mass. And we have, I don't remember, about over 100 R-process isotopes taken from tables of people that computed this in detail. So we just took the parameters for all the R-process isotopes as input in the upstream of the shock in the unchopped ejecta. And there is one constraint that should be satisfied, which is upstream of the shock, the plasma has to be charge neutral, so this equation must be satisfied. Okay. And then you solve a bunch of equations. I'm not going to go into this, but basically you solve energy, momentum, Maxwell, blah, 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 all coupled. That's why I have students do these things. Right, and now I want to show results. So I'll start.
Question, where's the streaming instrument?
No stimulation.
Two students.
That's what I showed in the relativistic case.
Yes, but are you implementing that in
Ask me at the end of the talk. Okay.
Okay. That will affect results, won't it?
This model is a similar model. It doesn't have any string instabilities. But it does something else, I get everything in it. And then at the end, you can discuss because I doubt it should be studied. So I'm going to show it in stages. Let me first consider a very simple case. It's a shock with only two ions, hydrogen and helium, no positrons, okay, two ions and electrons. And what you see here is the velocity profile. So this shock has a upstream velocity of 0.3, or the shock velocity is 0.3 speed of light. And this is the velocity profile. This color is the helium, and this is the hydrogen, and the black is the electrons. And what you see here is the electric field inside the shock. You see it's developed and then, and so you see that what's happening, there is a very large velocity separation because of the effect I described, because I have different charge to mass ratio. And now, in the downstream, the plasma is also charge neutral, like in the upstream. But this equation is one equation for three variables, so it has infinite number of solutions. In the upstream, we put all of the species to have the same velocity because that's the assumption. But in the downstream, we don't know what's the solution, but the solution actually follows from the entire evolution inside the shock. Actually, we can actually estimate the separation analytically, but I'm not going to go into these details. So that's what happened, and now you see there is actually huge velocity separation. And in principle, if that was the situation, then hydrogen and helium would collide here and induce fusion. Now, this is how it looks like for a full R process material. So this is the same solution as before, except that instead of hydrogen and helium, there is no hydrogen here, but there is helium, and like a bunch, 120 R-process isotopes. They are all shown in this color. They will be designated as gallium. And you see again, there is a velocity separation between the heavy ions and in particular between the helium and the heavy ions. Okay, so I'm going back to the previous point that something is missing here. Eventually there will be couple. So what's missing here is some model for friction. The one that you can actually calculate from this principle is, can you guess? Like what would you? Very nice, Chris. The one is Coulomb collision. So the first one that you would like to check is Coulomb collision. So we included Coulomb collision in the model, and there are hundreds of Coulomb coefficients. And one point to notice is that they're quite sensitive to the charge. So heavy ions feel a much stronger friction than the helium. I'll get back to this point. And what you see here is when you include it self-consistently Coulomb collision, for these shocks, everything is coupled fantastically. If you actually raise the velocity to 0.5, it will not be true anymore, because you see it's very sensitive to the relative velocity or temperature, if you wish. But for this velocity, it's coupled. There is one delicate point here, is the helium is not coupled by Coulomb collision, it's coupled by the electric field. So you still see this charge separation in the development of the electric field. So all of the heavy ions are coupled by collision, but the helium is coupled by the electric field. All right, so what's next? We're done, no effect. Well, we neglected the positons. To actually calculate the positron abundance, I asked my colleague, Japanese colleague Ito Iwataka, which I owe him a lot because he actually developed a whole technique, Monte Carlo technique, to calculate the solution of these shocks very in detail. I asked him to run a simulation for a single fluid model, but for an arc process material. This is not published, it's just a framework. And what you see is that even for a 0.3, you see very large abundance of positrons in the shock. The reason is that the densities are huge. Density of merger ejecta larger by 10 of magnitude in supernova. So now you have to include the positron in the modeling. We didn't calculate the self-consistency, but we included, in addition to what I showed before, we included positrons, and now it's very interesting what's happening, because now you see that the helium is separated from the other. All of the ions are still coupled by Coulomb collision, but the helium is separated. And the reason is twofold. First, because you have the opacity is dominated by pairs, the actual width of the shock is much narrower than before. And it's narrower compared to the deceleration length of the ions. You can see it here. And the second point is that you see the electric field is completely screened out by positrons. So the helium now decelerates by Coulomb collision and not by the electrostatic field, and it takes time. And in fact, you find large velocity separation even for this shock. And there is a region here where the collision energy of helium and heavy arc process material will exceed the Coulomb barrier, namely it will be inelastic, and such collision will undoubtedly induce nuclear transmutation. And you can see here the inelastic collision depth measured in the Thomson length units. It's pretty small. It means that all of these elements will be affected, will undergo nuclear reactions. So what will be the outcome is a very difficult question, because this process is out of equilibrium. You cannot just calculate. You have to calculate it directly, which is not so easy. And I'm about to finish. The final point is free neutrons. So you should ask about free neutrons. So I'm showing here a calculation of the unshocked ejecta before the shock is launched by Skynet. This is just an example. But what you find typically, so you see this blue line is the free neutron, and what you find typically is a very large abundance of free neutrons that actually dominate everything, where the ejecta is still hot enough. Up to about 1 second, here it's a bit larger, where you reach the freezer point, and all of the neutrons at once, they actually get captured in the heavy nuclei. Okay, you see, the abundance drops to 10 orders of magnitude. So, now this is just, one needs to actually study this in more detail, and they are working with this now, but this is a typical profile that you see in many of these simulations of ejecta, people that do nuclear synthesis. This actually is computed by the student alone. And the point is, if the shock is launched early enough, it will actually encounter this region. So it will actually propagate in a plasma with abundance of free neutrons. If it launches too late, then it will not.
But how does it accelerate in the first place?
Sorry?
How do free neutrons get accelerated in the first place?
They are not accelerated.
Not at all, right? They just get absorbed.
No, they are just flow with the ejector. You ask, how does it couple?
How do
By,
they get
They were
velocity?
originally accelerated hydrodynamically, and then they just
Oh,
coasted.
by collision.
yeah, they are coupled by, I'm going to get it, but elastic, if the Newton velocity is not too large, it will just undergo elastic collision
Right.
with a huge cross section with
I
the
see.
protons.
Then when the velocity is
So they are just get drift. And, okay, so what happens here now? Shock passes this plasma. And now, back to your question. Question is whether the neutrons will decelerate quickly with the shock or not. And this is the answer. Not terribly surprising, but even though they have large cross-section for elastic scattering, it's not large enough. It's decelerating the neutrons, but quite slowly. As you see here, this is the quantity calculation, which takes into account both elastic and inelastic. And so there is a region here where the neutron energy is large enough to induce fission in many elements. And typically activation barrier is 25 MeV or smaller for most elements. That's the collision energy thinning. And here is the calculation of these fission depths. And again, what you could see here is that many of the sufficiently heavy nuclei will actually undergo fission. And again, this will lead to composition change, etc. behind the shells. So either collision with helium or neutron capture, depending on the delay between shock launching and the neutron subdivision. So I'll stop here. I just said that in future work, what one has to do, and planned it, but I don't know what happened, is to actually calculate self-consistently the temperature and top production in the shock, because we just assume a multiplicity which we find from single fluid models, and that will probably quantitatively will not change, I don't know. And the other thing which Chris asked is, it could also be that if you have large enough separation, you have plasma instabilities. For these shocks, probably not. Well, maybe for the helium, it's a question. So I try to motivate Paramount to look at it. But actually, if you look in a region where the shock is much faster, you start seeing separation even with heavy ions, because coulomb collision will become less and less effective. Not even at a realistic regime, but even for 0.5, 0.6, I think at these velocities, you will need different stuff. My guess is that it will not be sufficient to couple the ions on the scale of the shock. So, but that's still another question. Yeah, okay, so this, I can stop here somewhere.
Thanks, Amir. There were no questions online except whether it's information was 2D or 3D, but that's
it's a bottom line question. Considering the observed thought process of one instance, does the shock help or hurt?
Help to produce the process.
I.e.,
Solar outputs abundance? That's not the question I'm asking. And it's not so much relevant because, as I say, this change in nuclear compositions is only in a small volume of the ejecta, it's not the entire ejecta.
fair enough.
So it will be a small effect on this, but it will affect the early filament condition.
Other questions in the room?
I guess one question is, in the situation where you have alpha particles streaming and overcoming the Coulomb barrier, is there some nucleosynthesis analogy that we should be thinking of, like a rapid alpha process, basically?
So you're asking what's the outcome?
What's the outcome?
So I try to look in, there are these huge books of data from experiments. Most of them are at somewhat higher energies than what we need here. There are hundreds of, channels, just impossible. And what's difficult here is that, unlike what Skynet could do, for example, it's not in thermal equilibrium. Most calculation I encounter assumes LTE. Okay, so you have Maxwell distribution and you're not calculating. Here it's something completely different. So you actually need either, I found data for some elements, and it's extremely involved problem. You can rule out many reactions because they're too slow. But bottom line is that you will get change of composition. Exactly what is the nuclear reaction channel is a very difficult problem, very difficult calculations. And I don't know if even, I actually asked low energy nuclear physicists in my group to run many-body simulation of this. So they had a collision, but it was at energies a bit larger, and you actually see in the simulation, just two process elements. You see there are actually cases even where you get fragmentation, but there is also fusion. So it's very involved. I don't know.
Questions?
I have a stupid one. So this jet is just like one spurt, right? It says only a couple seconds. When you show the simulation, it's not a continuous jet launching from the
Continuous is a relative term. Right?
Say it again?
Continuous is a relative term.
Okay,
It's
fine.
continuous. It's continuous as long as the engine is correct.
Right, so your radiation process, the radiation is a drag on the jet.
Which radiation?
Your electron positron interacting with photons and being
That's
dragged
in the
down.
shock, yeah.
Yeah, in the shock, being dragged down. So
It's
is it
not a
guaranteed
jet, it's a shock. It's cool.
in the shock? Is it guaranteed that you're going to get a breakout? Will the jet actually slow down to?
Well, breakout you will probably get, depending on the question of what will be the energy. So
Right.
what I'm saying is, in general, if you know how much energy you pump in, and actually report rate,
To
it's
calculate how
important,
much, right?
you can calculate even analytically with simulation. Well, Chris is the #1 expert on this.
So you actually end up with nothing and no breakout whatsoever, right? From the
Well,
radiation drag.
The issue with radiation drag is you have to have streaming between the jet and the radiation. And here the radiation is fully trapped within the jet.
Well, it's okay. It's not radiation, but dragon, it's what produces the shock transition. It's drag. It's not like a drag on the entire system.
On the
Yeah,
shock is experiencing.
This is what converting. This drag is.
This drag within the shock,
Is the
not a
dissipation
drag on the
mechanism.
jet that drives the shock.
That's what converts the bulk energy in the shock. If you're standing in the shock and moving with it, you see another obstacle coming towards you.
Right.
So this radiation drag is what converts the spark energy into random motion downstream. That's how then, okay. But it's not a drag on the entire system. In that sense.
Okay, I'll ask.
Or maybe, right?
We can talk about that.
But in this source, by the way, because we measure the jet,
Yep.
you know, we can say that we can actually know what's the, more or less, what's the breakout energy. That's what the calculator is.
All right, no more questions, and I have to say that there are refreshments in the lounge, I think, there should be, and let's thank Amir again. So don't necessarily follow my schedule for the dinner
Suggestion. Amir, do you have for dinner? Do you have a preference for your?
Which run what?
Do you have a preference for dinner?
No, but the only thing is that I don't eat meat. I don't eat fish and seafood, but no meat.
That's fine. I think, so it's gonna be you, me, and James Lamb, according to the study sheet.
Wouldn't be as
Okay, yes,
Oh,
that's
yeah.
fine. It's fine. I thought you were
So,
Tuesday, so.
So I think that's,
great.
Okay.
Okay.
Sort of set out. Yeah, so I think that the thing about.
call it, there are
Radiation
refreshments in the lounge, and Chris has,
Yeah.
you know,
Where you have like, radiations.
You have these tropic.
yeah, I know, yeah, let me switch off the Zoom.
So then you have like all these